Welcome to Spread the Word, a podcast brought to you by Biz. Our mission is to interview and share perspectives on gender to our community. You're here with Audrey, Sydney, Ahana, Isha, Liz, Serena, Megan, Shreya, Sajal, and Aaron.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast episode. We're here with Monica and Emily, and we're just going to be talking about gender in general and pronouns and just everything surrounding that. So the first question, I guess, is what struggles have the both of you faced as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, or your personal experiences, anything really about your experiences?
I mean, I guess, this might sound dumb right at first, but just acceptance, not necessarily even just outside of the community, but even within the community, there is a lot of gatekeeping. So you can see people gatekeeping certain identities. There's some people who gatekeep asexual or aromantic people, and I happen to identify as both, and those are just people who don't experience romantic attraction or sexual attraction. And so some people will say, that doesn't belong in the LGBTQ plus community, and other things. And there's a lot of gatekeeping within the community, not just with those two identities. So it can struggle to go to a place where you're supposed to feel safe and accepted, and then still struggle with that.
Do you have any maybe solutions that come off the top of your head that maybe ways that we can better understand that situation or handle that situation?
Yeah, I mean, within the community, I would say there's a lot of people that don't necessarily try to do that. And so that's great. But I think that this is almost the same for the people that are within and without, or not within the community. And that would just be to listen to those people and listen to their experiences. Because, you have to remember that at one point, just being gay was super out there, not mainstream. And now it's a lot more mainstream. So if we can kind of raise that awareness and listen to the people who identify with those gate-kept identities, then it's a lot easier to kind of wrap your head around it, and you can ask questions or you can Google it or whatnot. And that just makes everything better, listening to those people.
Going along with what Em was saying about gatekeeping and listening to voices, it's really frustrating seeing people try to speak about issues or speak over in issues that don't necessarily apply to them, especially when it comes to issues within the LGBTQ community. For example, the whole issue with TERFs and trying to, I'd see a lot of discourse on the internet that has to do with gender identity. And then I see cis people trying to say their opinion on it or try to speak out about it, even though it really doesn't apply to them. And then I even see discourse about sexual orientation, sexuality, and then I see heterosexual people try to speak about it when it's really not their place to say. It's just really frustrating. And then I agree with them. I think it's really important to just listen to people's voices or listen to people's experiences, try to understand where people are coming from. And yeah, it's just really frustrating seeing discourse, especially when it's super important for the LGBTQ community to kind of stay a little united or face issues that affect the community as a whole, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you guys you both talked about the concept of gatekeeping. So I was wondering if you both could kind of elaborate more on gatekeeping and what it is, especially in regards to the LGBTQ community.
I think in a broad sense, gatekeeping just refers to keeping certain people out, whether that be a physical place or a community. So the gatekeeping would kind of be saying, only some people are a part of the community for in this instance. So like that could be saying, oh, only, you know, people who are like homosexual, who are gay, can come in here, rather than also people who are, you know, trans or queer or fall under any sort of different umbrella. So like that gatekeeping can happen within the community from people that are in the community and say like, no, you're not a part of this, you don't belong here. Or it could occur from like people outside of the community who basically say the same thing, except they're just looking on, they're not even within that community.
Yeah, I think like an example of that would be telling a bisexual person who is dating someone of the opposite gender that they're not bisexual, or they're not allowed to call themselves bisexual, even though like their current like relationship status doesn't really define their sexuality as a whole. And like another example would be saying like if you present too femme, then you can't like be a lesbian, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's just like trying to keep people out of like a certain like space, and like applying it to like the LGBTQ community, and like terms that refer to people's like identity. That's basically just people enforcing their own definition of a certain identity on someone else, even if their like definition might be a little bit different, because a lot of the time it's really about like the person's own experiences. Like labels are supposed to be like something for people to like find a community, something to find, or something that people use to find comfort or kind of like help like discover themselves. And so yeah, like gatekeeping is really like can be really harmful, and I can see why some people choose to gatekeep, because some people find a really strong sense of identity within the labels that they choose, and it's scary when people who have a different definition of that label try to like identify as that. But a lot of the times, or most of the time, it's still wrong, because you know you don't understand the other person.
Yeah, I think it's like really interesting that like still like people feel like they need to be placed in a certain box, if that makes sense. Like if you can't just like, you know, be yourself, like having to, you know, be a specific kind of way. I think that's an interesting concept. Okay, so our next question is, what are your thoughts or personal experiences with gender and pronouns? So like, for instance, a lot of people like, you know, use like the wrong pronouns when identifying someone. So like in what ways do you think people who are not a part of the LGBT community can like be better and, you know, correcting themselves and like identifying people as they would like to be identified as?
So I actually identify as non-binary and use they, them pronouns. So I feel like this is a great question. I mean, a lot of it, if you make a mistake, you make a mistake. Like, it's really not a big deal. And there are people who will, if they make a mistake and they realize, or they get told later, they make like a giant whole production of it. And I think that's just not necessary. It brings a lot more attention to the issue than just either kind of correcting what you're saying, or being like, pull them aside in private and just be like, hey, sorry about that. Like, I'll do my best to remember. But I think a way to kind of show that you are an ally and that you're kind of willing to think about that is in situations kind of, especially when introducing yourself to new people, to say, oh, hi, like I'm M, oh, and I go by they, them pronouns, even if that pronoun is kind of what someone looking on might assume that you use. And that just kind of lets the other person know that, oh, like they're kind of a little bit more educated on this subject and they're willing to hear my pronouns. So like whether or not that pronoun like changes later, they kind of have that little knowing that they can trust you.
I think a lot of people like me, I'm cis, so I don't go by I go by she, her pronouns. And I think what a lot of people are trying to do now is put their pronouns in like their social media bios or like in their names or next to their names, to kind of normalize the idea of giving your pronouns, or not like make it more comfortable for people to like share their pronouns, if that makes sense. But it's also important to know that it doesn't stop there, like in terms of like making like sharing pronouns like more comfortable. But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I also would like to say, like, I definitely think that that should be more like widespread, like you were talking about. Like, at my workplace, I work at a clinic, and I have sometimes like patients come in that go by different pronouns, and I feel like it's a little disrespectful to not ask them prior to us going through this whole exam. So I feel like maybe something that we could put like when they're like checking in, or like even on their chart, is like what pronouns they go by, so we can make it as respectful as possible. So I feel like making it more widespread would also help a little bit, but I'm not really sure if that's like mutual from both sides.
I mean, like, I definitely see what, like, kind of agree with that and see what you're saying, just because, like, the first thing is kind of to let people know that asking someone's pronouns is a great way to start, but, like, putting someone's pronouns, like, in their chart or asking them beforehand is great, because then that kind of solidifies it. So then, like, every time, like, if I go in and see one doctor and they realize that, if I go in and see a different doctor next time, it could be more of a, oh, yeah, like, I'm reviewing their chart, they know that they use they them pronouns, and, you know, whatever medical issue you're coming in for, or like whatever the case may be based on that different situation.
Yeah, so we also wanted to ask how you found your role in this community, and if you had difficulty understanding your role, what advice would you give to those who are also struggling with these same questions?
I think it took me a while to realize that you don't necessarily have to have a tangible role in the community if you don't want to. I mean, like, I happen to be board of a club that works specifically with the LGBTQ community, and that's great. I love doing that. But if there's someone else who just wants to kind of be able to recognize their identity themselves and not really do anything else, they can do that. But despite not having to do that, like, choose a role, there are a lot of things that you can do if you want to. There's a lot of like social media support pages at the moment, or even just like Facebook groups or something like that, where it's only like trans people and, or, you know, lesbian people or whatever, and that might not impact what you're seeing like that on Facebook. That might just be normal posts, but it's kind of nice to be able to say, like, oh, you know, I know these people and I kind of have that connection with a larger community. And a lot of people, I think, really enjoy knowing that they're not alone. So I think that would be like a really good way to kind of have a first step of getting involved.
Yeah, and I also think a lot of it is like self-discovery and figuring out like what you're comfortable with. And yeah, just exposing yourself to information, doing your research, if you need to, and just like, you know, I feel like this can be applied to like a lot of other things in life. But yeah, it's like just like being informed, you know.
Yeah, kind of like a follow-up to that question, a little more specific to IMSA. How do you think IMSA can better handle like bias incidents towards based on gender and like sexual orientation on campus, or just better provide resources in general for the community?
I mean, a lot of the people at IMSA, most of them are very accepting, and that's fantastic. That's already like makes me at least feel like a lot safer going and being like out and proud. But I think that there definitely are bias incidents that occur, and I think part of it is realizing that that's not okay. And there's a lot of things that if you hear them and you're a part of the community, that's something you've maybe heard like 100 times. And so it might not have any true meaning to you. And even though it's kind of a problematic thing to say. So in that case, like, I'm not saying you have to fill out a bias incident report, but there's definitely some more education that I think could be done by IMSA to say that even if it doesn't bother one person, it can still be problematic, because I definitely have seen and heard people who have said like, oh, well, it didn't bother this person, So like it's totally fine, whereas that might not necessarily be the case.
I also think providing protection to people who fill out bias incident forms is really important, because even though you can fill it out anonymously, a lot of the time, like if an incident happens, whether it was a bias incident that has to do with like the LGBTQ community, or if it's like a racial issue or a gendered issue, a lot of the time when things happen after the bias incident is like filled out, the people involved know who filled out the bias incident form, if that makes sense, or know who might have. So I think providing protections for those who try to speak out about like any incidents that happen is really important. And then like whether that means like maybe an RC comes around the room a little more often, like the person's room a little more often, or like they have like some like administration like sit in like, or not administration, but like you like they tell like a teacher who like happened to be in like a classroom when like an incident happened to just like keep an eye out for anything like further that like could affect people in the classroom. Just anything like that could be really important. And then also it's to recognize that the institution isn't perfect, because I think IMSA definitely makes more of an effort, at least in my experiences, it makes more of an effort to try to be diverse, or try to like train students to like have a more open mind, if that makes sense. And so comparing that to like all the other schools, like I would say that like IMSA does a pretty good job, and other students would agree, but like you still have to recognize that things still happen in the institution. And by saying that, oh yeah, IMSA is like like the most accepting environment, or like IMSA is perfect, it really makes it hard for people who experiences any incidents that happen within the institution to kind of speak out about it, because then they're probably going to think like, oh well, my issue isn't that bad. Like people could be thinking like, oh, it could have been worse, if that makes sense. But yeah, and I also think training for teachers is also important. Maybe like encouraging all teachers to add like you know those get to know me forms like the teachers will send out at the beginning of like the semester, like, oh, like what's your name, like what should I know about you. Maybe like encouraging teachers to add like areas in the form that's like, oh, what should I refer to you in front of your parents, what should I refer to you in the classroom, and like what are your pronouns in front of your parents, what are your pronouns in the classroom, could really make students a little bit more comfortable with sharing like their identities like to their teachers, if that makes sense.
And then I think another topic we kind of want to touch on was like what you think about like the LGBTQ community in terms of like the intersectionality with different communities. So for instance, like with like racial groups and different ethnic groups, like in that intersectionality, like what often do you notice about it? Or like for instance, I know like for some individuals who are part of the LGBT community and for example, like African American, like those disparities could be much higher. So like, what are your thoughts on like that intersectionality or like the correlation between the two?
I mean, like, I definitely think intersectionality is important. And I think that just kind of adds another level of challenging to that person, which kind of sucks to say, but I think we all know that, because if they're dealing with the stigma from being a part of the LGBTQ community, and they additionally have to deal with stigma of like being a part of the African American community, or like being disabled or something like that, that oftentimes can set up a lot of people who are looking on to automatically be extra wary of them because of many reasons. But I think a lot of the times because they're demanding respect. And wow, I'd love to say that is an automatic thing that everyone gets from everyone else. It's not. And I think it's a lot harder for people to wrap their minds around multiple things if they're not necessarily an ally. of those communities, and they might be thinking that the person asks too much, and that really sucks. As a part of like the disabled community as well as the LGBTQ community, it sets you up to kind of think about what you can prioritize. Because if I'm going up to someone that I don't know and I have to ask them something for some sort of like accommodation in class or something maybe out of the norm, am I going to choose to ask them to respect my pronouns, or am I going to choose to ask them to make accommodations for my disability? And that definitely sucks to have to make that like prioritization, because for me at least, that's never going to be my pronouns. That's a lot less important to me, but those two things should not be mutually exclusive. I will say there are people within a community that I've seen that try and play like almost in a bingo of being oppressed. And they'll be like, oh, well, like, listen to me first, because not only am I gay, but I'm also disabled. And I just don't think that's okay, because if I'm discussing a LGBTQ issue, everyone's voices within that community should be kind of heard equally. And I think that's hard for a lot of people within the community to remember, is that everyone's voices should be heard. And that kind of almost goes back to the gatekeeping comment right at the beginning, is that there's a lot of gatekeeping within those intersectional things, which sucks, but it can't be fixed with a snap of the fingers. You just have to kind of raise awareness and break down the stigma for each group individually before you can break down barriers for the both groups like at the same time in the same person.
Another thing is, I feel like some people in the LGBTQ community sort of water down intersectional issues, if that makes sense. This might sound weird, but people tend to forget that just because you're oppressed for one thing doesn't mean you can oppress, doesn't mean you can't oppress others. For example, I've seen a lot of racial issues within the LGBTQ community, like excessive use of AAVE and the appropriation of Black culture within the LGBTQ community. And that's an issue. And I don't know, you can't play, I agree with M, you can't play oppression bingo. Everybody's voices should be able to be heard. And it's kind of disheartening, seeing other people in my community be ignorant about issues that have to do with race like that, because I know in my head I'm going to be judged first for being Asian and female before I'm gonna be judged for being gay, because gay isn't something that I don't know how to how to put it, but I think people should understand white able-bodied LGBTQ members should understand that issues are issues can be intersectional, if that makes sense. LGBTQ people of color face different issues than non-POC LGBTQ members. And yeah, that's about all I can speak on. But yeah, I agree with everything that Em said too.
Kind of going off the idea of intersectionality, what's your view on the relationship between women's rights and LGBTQ plus rights?
I mean, I at least think they're connected, or at least there's a lot of overlap, but they're not they're definitely not the same thing. So as a female or someone who is assigned female at birth individual who is also part of the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of overlap that I've seen with feminism, pioneering for both the rights and equality of women, but also LGBTQ people, because a lot of those rights are being withheld or that equality is being withheld from those people, from both those communities in a very similar way. But at the same time, you have people like TERFs, which are trans exclusionary radical feminists, who basically don't believe that trans women are real women. And it's tough to kind of see where that intersectionality stops, because if I'm trying to get women's rights, that applies to all women, regardless of whether they were assigned female at birth, regardless of whether they menstruate, or regardless of really anything else. And so there's like an overlap there, but some people don't see it. And it's kind of hard to say that issues, particularly issues regarding like the LGBTQ community and like women's rights issues, we love to say they fit in little boxes, and with most things they really don't fit in those little boxes. They kind of bleed over into each other, whether that be with one individual or just with the group as a whole. And so I think that they kind of bleed into each other, even though there are issues that each face that might be different from the other.
Okay, cool. So like that's all like the questions we had. Did either of you want to just add anything before we like wrap it up? No? Okay, cool. Well, thank you both so much for coming.